you can't just go to Mars anytime. It's not like the moon. You actually have to, the two planets have to be really close, basically. And it only happens every couple of years. And so we really got to hit that if we want to get on a cadence, and we want there to be at least one mission during the next launch window. And then we want like 100 ready to go for the next window, because you can't just wait 4 years and be sitting on your hands. You got to test a lot. And so there are 601 days until October 7th, 2026, which is the mass optimal launch window to Mars and when that opens. So he says he doesn't have any privileged information, but it's fun to speculate about what SpaceX could choose to send on its first Starship flights to Mars. Spoiler alert, he thinks it's rods from God, which is fun. So over the
By the way, Calder in the chat says having to plan around the optimal launch window is a skill issue.
Skill issue, yeah, that's great. And so over the next 600 days, SpaceX has a number of key technologies to demonstrate orbit, reuse, refill, and chill. So orbit, this Friday, we're due for Flight 8 of Starship, which will be very cool to watch. And this one may finally achieve orbit. Earlier flights technically had the performance necessary, but deliberately targeted the ocean to prevent the possibility of a Starship being stranded in orbit without propulsion capability and then undergoing an uncontrolled re-entry and crashing. Reuse, this is the holy grail of rocketry. SpaceX has indicated that they may attempt to refly Booster 14 on Flight 9, which would establish booster reuse. Flight 9 may also see the first attempt to catch the Starship upper stage. But in any case, the successful reuse of both stages of Starship is necessary to fly to Mars. We got to be reusing these things if we're going to make it economical to get there and get back continually. Refilling, we can load Starship up with cargo for Mars, but it's not going to leave low Earth orbit unless Starship can be refilled with fresh fuel and oxidizer. SpaceX has been working on orbital refilling for some time, but we need to see it actually working. So you got to get a bunch of fuel up to space and then refill once you're in space, which is crazy because we're not sending something
Can
small.
we also talk about how uncontrolled re-entry is the best?
That's just like crashing anywhere.
For crashing, for just slamming back into the atmosphere. Not good.
Yeah. So it's high stakes stuff. They might have to shoot it out of the world, or if it's shoot it out of the sky if it's coming down over a populated area. And then chill, by far the easiest of the four tasks, but long-term stability of Starship's cryogenic fuel will require that it be actively refrigerated, particularly in the challenging thermal environment of LEO or deep space. It's hard to make predictions, particularly about the future, but he's optimistic that SpaceX will have multiple fully fueled Starships ready to go in October of next year, followed by a 10-month cruise and then either Mars orbital insertion. And so he broke this down in another article. He has a couple different things that he thinks that they should work on, but we'll just skip right to the spoiler alert. He says rods from God. We know there's a high likelihood of mostly pure water exists within 10 to 20 meters of the surface across large swaths of the various prospective landing sites. Why not drop off a few dozen long steel or tungsten spears, guide them in while tracking them on radar, and then survey their impact craters with high rise as soon as the dust has cleared? These rods will impact the surface at about 8 kilometers per second. That's extremely fast. Penetrating many times their length and exposing the subsurface to our existing orbital instruments for the first time. The main attraction of this approach is that it requires essentially zero additional effort on top of the existing program, whereas the others require either a crash instrument development program or building and flying multiple intricate surface operations robots and landing them with an extremely untested EDL system. Rods from the gods merely requires dropping a few tons of steel in roughly the same area and then surveying the damage. It's also the only method that can deliver enough energy to actually directly access the deep subsurface at scale. And so JPL actually considered doing this. Of course, they went with robots, but I like that he's thinking outside the box and
this is the kind of citizen science that you've been asking Elizabeth Holmes to do, right?
Yes,
yes. Hey, you're in prison, but like prove that you're legit by being at the cutting edge, making I want to see Elizabeth Holmes, writing an open letter to Pfizer and saying, hey, you're doing it all wrong. Johnson and Johnson.
Yeah.
This is how you're making this mistake.
We
actually had this figured out.
Yeah, I
why don't
mean,
you try
we'll
this?
get to this later in the show, but H5N1, the bird flu's going around. What is Elizabeth Holmes' take? If she doesn't have one, keep her locked up.
Cold.
But
Cold.
anyway, he closes out by saying, if all this goes well, the technology situation in 2028 could look like this. And that's, I think, the next transfer window. Easier technology. SpaceX will have expertise in space solar, photovoltaics, Mars air separation, minor water prospectors. And SpaceX will not be an expert in pressure structures. And then the harder technology is orbital refueling, which we mentioned, cryofuel heat rejection, Mars EDL, spacesuits, long duration life support, surface life support, and water minor. And then SpaceX is not an expert in fuel plant, rock miners, construction robots, nuclear reactors. And this is, I mean, there's a lot of other companies that are working on this tech now.
Yeah. Yeah,
so
there's that. What's the team that spun out of SpaceX that's doing nuclear stuff now? It's the
Yeah.
it's the wife of the
Oh,
Farcaster founder.
Oh, I don't know. But there are a number of companies that have spun out of
I also
SpaceX
got
to
a
solve
pitch.
different problems that will
Yeah.
come up as we colonize the moon
Yeah.
and Mars. But what's really crazy is like there's all this noise around Elon, all this noise around tech and stuff, but things do seem to be relatively on track for a private company to deliver something to Mars in just a few years, which is crazy and a huge milestone. And so I'm super excited for that. And I'm excited to see where it goes. And I'm sure there'll be lots of other opportunities that crop up for businesses that are built on top of that plan, because SpaceX isn't going to do everything involved.
I got a pitch. I got a pitch last year, maybe it was 2023, for a team building gas stations on the moon. Like they were like, we are Chevron for space. That was the thesis of like basically building fuel depots on the moon. Which is a very cool thing to be thinking about.
So Doug Bernauer, the founder of Radiant, another Founders Fund, Andreessen portfolio company, he worked at SpaceX with Elon on special projects. Elon put him on a task. He you know how the Falcon rocket has those legs that land, and that's how it lands? They took those off when they created the chopsticks that catch it. But those legs come down and they land the
Are they like
Falcon 9.
LaFerrari doors?
Basically, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Cool.
the LaFerrari of the rocket world, I'm sure. And so he was working on that project. Then Elon was like, I like you, keep going, work on tunnels and boring company stuff for a while. And then he tasked him with, hey, when we get to Mars, what are we going to do for energy? And he ran the numbers on photovoltaics. And this is a little bit controversial. Not everyone agrees with his conclusion, but basically, because Mars is farther away, it gets less light. And so he was saying, if you need to set up solar panels to refuel a rocket to generate enough power, essentially, you'll need to bring tons and tons of just so many solar panels, and the math doesn't quite work out in his mind. And so what he said was, you should bring a nuclear reactor, a smaller nuclear reactor, drop it down. It generates a lot of waste heat, which can be used to melt ice, creating water. And then you have a nuclear reactor that can then create the fuel out of the natural resources and then refuel the rocket and then come back.
And
he's been working on that.
It's a perfect plot to a sci-fi movie now.
Yeah.
And it could be a good catastrophe documentary. Yeah. It's like, hey, we dropped this reactor and set off this chain of events that destroyed the universe. But and now we have to got to save the universe.
We got to save him. And so, I mean, they've taken that. I mean, that's kind of like the long-term inspiration for Radiant, but in the short term, they're building basically a nuclear reactor in a shipping container, and you can drop it off on a military base. You can drop it off on an oil and gas extraction site. You can drop it off at a hospital if they need a 1 megawatt diesel generator. You can just replace that with a 1 megawatt nuclear reactor, and it lasts for 5 years or 10 years instead of like a couple days until you need to refuel it with diesel. So in the military, you have to deliver diesel through these convoys and these trucking like over and over and over again. Radiant kind of eliminates that need. And so they're going into testing now and working on that.